Welcome to the Probability Podcast. Discussions on emerging and converging technologies, problems that are being solved, and the probability of positive and negative outcomes that we might expect. Now, please welcome your hosts, Jason, the generator Spracklin, and Patrick, the discriminator Lozon.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Probability Podcast. This week the topic is traffic technology. We'll be talking about the digital overhaul of our roads. There's a great modernization that is turning aging intersections into AI-powered brains capable of thinking and reacting in real time. We'll analyze how the dumb timers of the past are being replaced by adaptive AI that can predict a traffic jam before it even forms. We'll look at the rise of the connected car and the race to set a global standard that allows vehicles to talk to the infrastructure around them. We'll also explore radical new ways cities are staying resilient during power outages, from mobile grids, where an electric fire truck can plug directly into a traffic cabinet to keep the lights on, to preemptive technology that clears a path for ambulances before the station doors even open. Join us as we look at the evolution of the street itself as it moves from static pavement to an active thinking partner in our daily commute. We'll talk about what it means for our society when the infrastructure we've always taken for granted begins to make its own decisions to keep us safe and moving. So Patrick, have you ever noticed that anybody driving slower than you is an idiot and anyone going faster than you is a maniac?
Isn't that the case, eh? And now we got AI behind the wheel. What's he going to do?
I don't know. That was a good old George Carlin quote. Great observation. You know, how basically about our perception, right, of when we're in our vehicle, our perception of other drivers, and it's a whole different ecosystem than we're used to on a kind of daily basis. How we interact in person versus how we interact, you know, when we're in a vehicle, and how we perceive the world is two totally different things, I think, right?
Yeah. So the first thing we got to talk about is really about, everybody's heard about the ultimate system in the municipality that controls all the lights, right? And somehow if you can just, get in and break into that system, you get those green lights all the way, right?
Those in that movie, like in that movie, The Italian Job.
The Italian Job, yeah.
Where the guys, they were trying to set up this heist, right? Where they were trying to get back at the guy from stealing all this gold. And they, so essentially, this guy was part of this group of, thieves, I guess, that stole this big pile of gold. And then he kind of screwed them over and took it all. And then he built this huge house, this mansion in LA. And then they were going after him to get the gold back, essentially. And that he was, because he knew that he was trying to move it, so that they wanted to figure out how they would corner this guy, essentially. And so they had the tech genius on the team break into the city grid and change all the lights so that this truck would be forced to go into a particular area, right, where they had cut out, or they were going to cut out the ground, so this whole truck just fell through the pavement down below, type thing. I'm pretty sure that was
I remember that. And they were running Mini Coopers, and they went through the sewer and all of it. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing. It's one of my favorite movies, actually. So certainly we're going to talk a lot about, AI-powered traffic systems and what have you, but I also think it's important to go kind of back and talk about some of the basics, right? And some of the way these systems originally emerged, because I think a lot of people still think maybe these systems still operate like this. So when we think about the intersection that we all know that we come up to, right? And there's traffic lights that are controlling that, and it's either a red, an amber, or green that's telling you what to do, or you get a left turn signal, or however all that plays out, right? Is everybody generally understands traffic signals. I think what people don't understand is for many, many years, even as far as relatively recently, these systems were basically set on a timer, right? So they would figure out how they want the intersection to operate, and it would just cycle through what they call these phases, right? So if you ever heard the term signal phases, it means it just kind of goes, okay, it goes green this way, and then you get a left turn, and then it's red that way, and it just just keeps cycling through. It doesn't matter how much traffic is coming through that intersection, that it simply won't break its cycle or pattern And what's funny is there's still many lights that run like that. In fact, there's a huge percentage of traffic lights in North America that aren't even connected to the internet. That basically they drive out in a truck, they set the timer, and they only go and change that, what they call the timing plan, if they get complaints, or if they do a study and realize that traffic is not moving through that area in the way they want to. And I think there's a certain amount of people that maybe think all traffic lights run like that, and then I think there's people that think like everything is smart now, and I think the answer is like somewhere in between. So it's kind of interesting when you think about all the technology that we have today, and yet there's still many lights that are just running on a cycle. Like, have you ever sat at a light where it's like there's no other traffic, and yet you're sitting here at a red light? In all transparency, right? I work for a company that is in the traffic technology space, so I've certainly learned a lot about the technology behind the traffic, and you can put a lot of it in place, but you can't always fix every problem that's out there. But I think it's interesting in the sense that when you look at that, so the base of these signals are that they're just running on a timing pattern. And the way they used to do studies, and not even that long ago, you've probably seen this yourself, Patrick, where you remember driving down the road and you see the guy standing on the side of the road with a clipboard.
Yeah.
Maybe a couple of guys.
Or a cable going across, counting. Yeah.
Well, they do the cable things, or the tubes, or what have you, right? But essentially, the company I work for, they started because the three guys that started the company had the summer job where they were on the sides of the road counting traffic, and that was how the cities would do their studies about how much traffic is going through like this particular area or intersection. You got a guy on the side of the road going 1 car, 2 car, 3 car. So then they decided to create this portable unit that had a camera in it, and even then, all the camera was doing was just filming the cars on the road. Then they would set these up at different intersections, and then they would bring that back to an office, and they'd sit and watch the video and count the cars that way. Well, that allowed them probably to do counting at more intersections, and then actually like sit down instead of standing at the side of the road counting them. So they used the video, and then they came up with the idea of using like computer vision, which is essentially a video connected to AI, some sort of like machine algorithm. I mean, this is long before what we know now as AI, but and the algorithm was taught like what a car was. So then they figured out how to use this video to automate the counting of cars, right? Mm-hmm. And then that just evolved over like many years to being like cameras at intersections that are smart cameras powered by AI that are able to look at traffic in real time and change signals and that kind of thing. But it always starts with something like relatively rudimentary. Even today, where you have lights that are set up to be somewhat adaptive, they basically have what they call these like loops. There's other mechanisms, but they basically install sort of like a giant magnet type apparatus under the pavement, and so like when you drive your car over it, it detects that there's a vehicle above it, and then it sends that signal to the traffic cabinet, and then it changes the lights so you can make that left turn, right? And there's still a lot of that.
That's the left turn indicator. Thank goodness it exists. Yeah.
So I mean, that's a very rudimentary way, but every time that fails, they have to dig up pavement, or every time they need to install something like that, they have to dig up pavement. So that's why the technology has moved more to video, as opposed to these sort of more manual ways to detect whether there's cars there or not, type thing, right? So it's interesting how kind of all that tech. I wanted to go back and talk about some of the very rudimentary technology, and a lot of it still exists. There are areas in the world that they don't want to use cameras for privacy reasons or cost reasons, and they're just running loops in the ground. There's a lot of cities across the world that are just still running like very old traffic technology, and for all intents and purposes, it's not that that's a bad thing. It's not that it doesn't work well. It's just not very smart or adaptive when situations or conditions change, right? Yeah. So it's a bit rudimentary, but it does work. Like, there's a lot of technology that doesn't have to be super advanced for it to work, right?
Yeah, like complexity isn't necessarily the answer everywhere, right? So I think the other side of this is that you have this is like, if you look at a road system, it's many paths, right? Many combinations. It's a very complex model. Mm-hmm. And if you look at flow systems, mathematical flow systems, and how traffic behaves over time on these models, these road models, it's pretty complex, right? It's pretty if you're trying to predict behavior, it can be pretty difficult. And I think that's one of the things when you're looking at AI, they're using AI in these analysis of the traffic, and then it changes timing on behavior on the signaling. It's got to be able to explain, right? Like if you get complaints about a certain road or a certain intersection or what have you, you need to go back in time and you need to be able to say, okay, what exactly happened over this 48-hour period or this, you know, 10-minute period, what have you. You've got to be able to uh, also understand what these control systems are thinking and why did they do what they did. It could be an ambulance coming through which wasn't anticipated for, and it really messes up all the timing, right? That kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
stuff, right?
But I've also had it described in that traffic moves more like gas than water. It's an interesting
What
kind
do you
of
mean by that?
analogy. Well, it means that people think that, say, if you have a city with a lot of intersections, and say you have a problem at one intersection where that
Hmm.
gets blocked because of an accident, or say the light is going into flash, and then all of a sudden it kind of gets. You ever been to a intersection where it's in flash and everybody doesn't quite know where they need to go, and then everything kind of jams up? Well, people think that, okay, if this is jammed, then all the traffic is just going to kind of like divert and flow like water somewhere else. But in fact, there's this whole kind of like effect where it kind of disperses, because everything is not just going to then follow one way, because there's just not the nature of the way that we move. And also, especially these days where everybody has GPS, where all of a sudden, if something's blocked, a car 3 blocks away will, Google Maps or Waze or whatever you're using, can detect some of that in real time. And if you've ever used something like Waze or Google Maps to route you somewhere, if it gets information that there's a traffic accident, it'll actually route you to another road. So in other
Hmm.
words, like one issue in one spot can cause traffic to really
Yeah,
disperse in
yeah,
many different ways, right? So it's just a bit different in that sense. And also you need the all the intersections to be effective need to kind of work together. And this is where this larger idea of, smart grids and thinking intersections is, because it's not just about the one intersection. That's why the old model doesn't really work as well anymore, especially in heavily trafficked areas, because these intersections need to coordinate together, right? Because if you have one working one way and the next intersection not coordinating to get the traffic through this intersection to that intersection, that's in the business what they call a corridor. So a corridor is like multiple intersections all in sort of a thoroughfare that's very busy. You need all three of those intersections to work together in order to properly manage all of that traffic flow. In other words, if you don't, you can have a light turn and all of a sudden you have a bunch of traffic stuck in the middle of the intersection because you didn't let things flow through properly.
hmm,
And now
yeah,
you've got what they traditionally would call a traffic jam, because now the lights turn, but you have a bunch of vehicles in the road where the vehicles going the other way can't come because they're blocked. And I see this happen actually at an intersection not far from my house oftentimes, where there's
right.
a main road turning onto another main road, and you have a lot of big trucks. And sometimes if the things aren't quite working, that you'll end up with the light turn, you can't go because there's a truck right in the middle of the intersection. There's nothing he can do either.
Yeah,
So there's a lot of complexity, not just at the intersection, but between intersections and down corridors that you need a lot of technology to kind of
yeah,
deal with
yeah.
as well,
Especially if you have
right?
lights intersections that are close together, and
Yeah,
you
that
have
too, which is the
congestion.
case with this one. Yeah, so it's
Yeah, yeah.
kind of
And the
interesting.
other thing too, I think it's important for everybody to understand now. I mean, a lot of these, the older technology systems were they try to be centralized on their decision making and their modeling and that. And you can't really do that because things are happening fast, right? So a lot of the newer systems now, they're actually trying to, support a heavy edge computing situation. So the traffic can make, or the particular intersection, there can be decisions made at that intersection at that time, and notify, the central system
Mm-hmm.
versus, the central system, that communication, handshaking. There's basically there's communication lag, I mean, that's a huge bottleneck, right? So these systems have to be able to be independent and that yet still work together, which is a bit of a challenge too, right?
Well, it is, yeah. I mean, that's where, if we want to get into this idea of like adaptive technologies, right? So it's
Yeah.
something that our company provides, and you've got a couple different ways to do that. So you've got, for example, we've got, two different cameras, right? One of them is sort of like a 360 camera that sits above the intersection. It looks down at all the what's happening kind of like through and kind of just around the intersection, so you can kind of see the cars that are coming up to the what they call the stop bar and so on. They can get a view of traffic, but it can only see so far out, right? So we have another camera that's more what you would call an approach camera, and you position that to look down the road coming towards that intersection, right? And you might put a camera at each approach, so now you can see kind of a bird's eye view of what's coming up to the the stop bars, and then your approach cameras can see what's coming, and you can kind of gauge demand and volume, what's coming down from the next intersection. So if you have a number of different intersections that are all connected to the same system, and you have these different cameras looking at overhead but also looking down towards the next one, now you have like full visibility. And back to what I talked about with like with counting cars and things. So this, these algorithms, the AI, the computer vision is what they call it, is it can count the vehicles and look. And so the system knows like, okay, well, because of the way these roads are, there's more traffic going east to west and north to south. So let's keep these green lights open. We don't need to like keep switching on the red because there's not enough demand coming from, say, the side streets. And then the cameras can see, oh, wait a minute, now there's a little bit more demand building, which it will over time. Like I have that near my place where it's like the main thoroughfare is very busy. Every now and again, a car will leave our neighborhood. So when enough of those cars come up to that stop bar, then the system will go, oh, there's some demand. So let me now put on a red light. Let's slow the like north to south. Let's let this east to west traffic come out, for example, right? And then it's sort of, so that's kind of more of like the adaptive, where the cameras are sort of like the eyes at the intersection communicating to the brain. So the brain would be in the traffic cabinet itself. So you probably don't notice it a lot, but every intersection has a box on the pole, and that has all the technology. A lot of it's electronics and different pieces that help the whole thing operate type thing. But oftentimes you have something like our company has like a box that goes in there. That's the brain that all the cameras are attached to. So now you're communicating to the brain, and the brain communicates to the controller. That's probably why I didn't mention it first, but inside every cabinet is what they call a controller, and the controller essentially is just telling the lights when to change, and that's either pre-programmed on a cycle, or it's doing it like adaptively, like we talked about. So that brain will say to the controller, hey, you need to come off this pattern and actually provide some throughput like east to west, and it changes the lights on the fly. So you kind of keep everything moving like dynamically, right?
Yeah. So a couple of things on that. One is, I don't want anybody to think this, but I mean, these imaging signals, like they're distilling the information down to lean data so they can communicate and build the models and update the AI, picture and that kind of thing about what's going on, right? It's not about having a full analog type of image of a truck or a car or whatever. And that's part of the that has to be done on the edge as well, right? So you're breaking it down to the very slender model of data, right, that can be transmitted and moved around. So everything can be understood, and it's a very small amount of data to transfer it. So it's all about performance and speed. So that's important. But then you talk about multiple cameras, and that gets into, let's talk about what happens when you have, bad weather, right? You have lightning, you have fog, you have snow, what have you. Now, what's being used there to help defeat all that?
Yeah, it's a good point, really. And then that's definitely a challenge in the industry as well. I can say that this is kind of where the computer vision comes into play in the AI, right? Because it can sort of like manipulate or fill in the blanks and, kind of figure out, okay, like visually, for example, I'm not able to quite see this, but if I evaluate everything that's around it, now I can kind of get a better sense of it. Now, by all means, there's certain conditions where that's where it's going to be almost impossible, where you have enough degradation because of a sun flare or because of like a heavy fog or heavy snowstorm.
Yeah,
That's when some of
sunflare.
these that's where some of these systems can break down, right? But what's happening now is you have other technologies emerging. So essentially, you have something called fusion, which you introduce a radar unit to this sort of setup, right? And sometimes they're in the same device where you have a camera, but you also have radar. So of course, radar works differently. It doesn't depend on sight, right? It's sending out some sort of pulse and it's detecting that things are there, right? And so that's kind of like the fail-safe for when the visual part of it is being interrupted. Now you've got the radar that's at least still counting it. Now it doesn't quite give you the fidelity of a video, where like computer vision can really detect multimodal. It knows the difference between a truck and a bicycle and a transport or what have you. The radar is a little bit more rudimentary, but it still does help fill in those blanks. Now you've also got other technologies happening in the industry now. Some people are making like thermal cameras. So it's detecting heat signatures, right? So there's obviously like a vehicle that's running. If you've ever given your vehicle a good run, you come back and you open the hood, your engine's got a lot of heat. So between that and the person in the car, now the thermal can kind of see what's going on. That doesn't rely on vision.
How's that work with EV, I wonder?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, maybe it doesn't as much, but there's still typically a person. But now when you think about like autonomous vehicles, so if you have a Waymo driving with nobody in it and it's electric, is there a heat signature? I don't know. So it's like you almost need to have different technologies that sort of complement or fill in the blanks. And then there's another technology similar to radar called LiDAR. And LiDAR works off of like laser beams, essentially, if you want to kind of break it down. So it's shooting out, now you don't see this when you're up to the intersection, but it's using laser beams to kind of do like a 3D mapping. And that's actually one of the more, outside of video, which is, obviously, is very, has a high fidelity, but the LiDAR can do a very accurate 3D mapping of anything on the road. The problem is that it's also susceptible to things like fog. Like anything that's going to interrupt that laser beam is a problem too. So as you can see, it's like, ideally, you may want to have a combination of two or even more of those technologies potentially. If you're in an area that's very prone to, extreme weather and what have you, but you might also have like things like loops or things on the ground that are detecting vehicles as another fail-safe too. So you look at this, there's all these different technologies. There's no real like sort of silver bullet, as it were, and that's why this idea of fusion is very popular right now in the industry, of like taking two technologies like computer vision camera and radar and pairing them together to give you kind of like the best of both worlds and that fallback and that type of thing.
Yeah, I can see that as a problem too, because I mean, they all have their different behaviors, and I I used to be in writing programs way back when, and we had plant automation, and we had multiple sensors feeding certain events and taking weights and doing counts and such as material went past. And if you had multiple readers, multiple sensors, if one was sensing something and the other one wasn't, or there's a discrepancy on what it sensed versus what the other one said, who do you believe? What do you believe? And it's all in real time, right? It has to be decided. So I think that's part of the challenge, is you got all these images coming to you, all this information. You have to distill it down and say, okay, this is what's happened, right? This is the truth, so to speak, of what's at the intersection, in a heavy fog or what have you. So I could see that as being a computation issue to make those, to pull that information together and make those decisions too.
Well, exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's why there's, the trend has moved to what they call edge computing, right? And that means that, I mean, theoretically, you could take all that data and stream it to the cloud, but by the time it goes to the cloud and gets processed and sends that command back, there's too much latency. So these boxes that they put in the controller interfaces, they have a lot of compute built into them. I mean, they're running GPUs similar to what's running, servers for AI and so on. So the edge computing is running inside this box that's in the cabinet, right? and the model, the computer vision model is running on the spot. And essentially the camera or the radar is just sending it. It says, oh, there's a car, there's a car, there's a car. It doesn't, the camera itself is not doing anything, or the radar itself is not doing anything. It's just detecting. In fact, that's a common term in the industry of detection. So it's detecting what's on the road. It's sending that information to the quote unquote brain. So it's like the cameras and the radar are like the eyes. It sends it to the brain. The brain is doing that processing in real time, and it's connected directly to the controller, and then it's telling the controller what to do based on what it can see. And that's the sort of the generally the basis of how these more modern, like adaptive and smart systems work. And then of course that has to be coordinated, like I said, across multiple intersections for the entire flow of traffic to work, like through the city. But and in some countries they can't even use cameras because of privacy laws, right? In certain countries, especially in Europe, you can't actually have cameras in the street because yes, you're capturing cars, but you're capturing people walking down the road. You're capturing people in those vehicles, and because of privacy and so on regulations, you can't do that. So that's the other kind of double-edged sword here, is that you can put in this really great technology, and I guess we kind of take it for granted, but there are countries that are very strict in those privacy laws where those options simply are not there, and that's where something like radar or LiDAR are things that are just mapping objects as opposed to like shooting video are more common in those areas. That's a whole different dimension to all this, right?
Yeah, and a lot, like I said, it's about distilling the data, right? So, these systems don't really need to have a full picture, right? Maybe some city manager wants to have a full stream video of everything that happens at that intersection for security reasons or what have you. And if that's required or as a requirement, then there's systems out there that can do privacy masking, right? With the data as it's coming in, so people's faces get blurred and all that. So there are ways to managing the privacy concern. It's just that it's a fact of, do you even know, right? The average citizen doesn't even know, right? And some of these systems that are running wide open, so to speak, they're collecting data and moving along, and this information's flowing, and nobody else should know, right? Would know. And I think that's a bit of a problem. I think cities need to be very forthright on how data is being moved and what data is being moved around, or what's stored, what's being presented to what party, and otherwise it becomes it's a surveillance issue, right?
Well, it is to an extent, yeah.
Yeah, and maybe surveillance is a good thing. Maybe, for if I'm a police officer trying to track down, a vehicle, or somebody got kidnapped, or we got an alert gone out, an Amber Alert, and we're trying to need to go back in time and up to current and find out where that particular vehicle is gone, who's driving.
You could track it in real time, right? I mean, with today's AI, I mean, you could basically feed a license plate number, for example, or even a car make into a system, and it could pick that up in real time, I think, pretty fast, and almost in real time tell officers where a perpetrator is, or what have you, right? I think it's always that balance, right, between like, okay, yes, the cameras are there, they're surveilling, but the argument is always, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, then why do you care? Because this is actually like helping society by having that information available, and certainly there's a case for that as well. But then there's also
even accidents, right? You get into an accident and you say, look, this guy hit me, I didn't hit him, or whatever, and they need to reconstruct the accident. They need to find out, and you as you basically saying, hey, I'm innocent here. You can use that information to help protect yourself, right?
100%, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of possibilities here. I think the lead into surveillance monitoring has to be handled with the privacy, umbrella of what the city does, because as soon as you introduce a system as complicated as these traffic flow management systems, then you instantly have all this data flow, right?
Well, absolutely, yeah. It's kind of funny though, because if you look at it, it also sets up a whole different scenario for the city, and this is something I've heard as well, right? Because there's sort of accidents and things every single day, and so it does create a bit of a I know if the word's burden, but like every time that happens, they have to go back and go into systems and recall video, and then they're involved with, the police officers,
There's
and in some
cost there.
cases they're providing, information to courts or what have you. Like it's a lot that a lot of cities simply don't have the capacity to deal with,
Yeah.
and so I
Or they
think.
just don't want to, they just simply don't want to provide that service. They just want to say it's
Well,
not
there's that. I
available.
think they would like to. I think it's just difficult, right? And it
Yeah.
creates an extra burden that's challenging. So I think they just are going to have to figure out if they want that sort of setup. They're going to have to figure out ways to kind of manage that. And maybe there's a more in this age of AI, there's a more automated way for that to happen. But also, if you look at, for example, like a lot of our technology can also tell cities where there's red light runners, right? So we've got reports because when you think about it, we've got the signal phasing. We know when the signals are red, and we've got the camera that shows when. I mean, this is sort of the basis of red light cameras, right? That everybody loves.
Yeah.
Um, actually, I ended up getting a red light running ticket not that long ago, like within the last year, and it was just one of those things. I was like half asleep and I was going a certain speed and I just didn't. And when I looked up, I knew I was going through this red light. And I'm like, and in my head,
Oh,
I'm
shit.
like, I'm pretty sure this is a red light camera because these systems like Waze will tell you. And sure enough, a week or two later, I got a ticket in the mail type thing, right? But
Mm.
these things are set up to discourage red light runnings in high risk areas. Well, how do they know where the high risk areas are? Well, they know because of these systems. These systems are telling,
Yeah.
they're giving reports and saying, well, here are your intersections with the highest red light running rate. And that could be for many reasons. In my case, it was just sort of a lapse in attention, but it can also mean like just a lack of like coordination between signals. And sometimes people are racing to make the next light, right?
Hmm.
And then so if they actually change the timing a bit, they would reduce this need for people to race the light because especially if you go the same way every day, people would know, oh, well, I don't have to race because I know this next light's going to go for me. Like I've got a light around the corner here where I come up to a main light, I turn left, and I guarantee you, I know exactly what's going to happen there. When I turn left, the next light, as I'm going straight, is going to turn red. But it won't turn red if I speed up fast enough, right? I'm not
Oh,
saying I'm going like crazy speeds, like 100 kilometers an hour, if
all
any
right.
law enforcement are listening here. But what I'm saying though is that
We're
when
gonna come
I
and
make
get you,
that
man.
turn, the first thing I do is hit the gas because if I know I hit a certain speed, I'm going to get through that next light. And that light is, for whatever reason, is on a very predictable track. And in fact, what they're doing, they're encouraging me to speed and possibly run that red light. It's not my fault,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
It's the
Well, I think okay.
technology's
So
fault, Patrick.
yeah,
At least
there's
that's
no
what I
one's
tried to
fault.
explain to my wife, but it didn't
Yeah.
go over so
Yeah.
well. So
It's
anyway.
now when I told my kids when they started driving, everything's your fault. When you're behind the wheel, everything's your fault. That's the starting point. But anyway,
Well, it's
forget
a good starting point,
yeah.
yeah.
So what? Okay, so we talked about all these devices and all these edge computers, running, with their AI models, 24/7, minute by minute, second by second. Um, what happens? We already talked about bad weather. So what happens if we got a power outage?
Well, that's a whole different game, I guess, right? Because then you have this sort of like general breakdown. I'm surprised people handle it as well as they do, right? When these lights go out and people try to coordinate themselves, right? But it
Well, there is a
certainly
little bit
creates
of
a
time. There's a
problem.
butter buffer, right, on these systems.
Yeah, there's a backup generator or what have you that's going to keep them running a certain amount of time, I suppose.
Yeah, the batteries. I think they got. I don't know. They're supposed to have like 4 hours runtime or something like that. Depends on the city, right? The cities define the policy, and then whatever systems they put in, they have to make sure they have that much runtime.
Well, yeah, there's certain intersections that are more critical than others, right? You have very sort
Right.
of big main intersections where they're known to be high trafficked, where they would probably want those systems, whereas like things can be managed more easily on side roads and that type of
Yeah.
thing, right?
Yeah.
In
The infamous
neighborhoods.
four-way stop flashing red light.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Which nobody seems to know how to. Well, it gets kind of complicated when you have, multiple lanes, right? You got two
Oh,
lanes or
yeah.
three
Well, you got
lanes.
people trying to turn left or right, and you have throughput, and yeah, it definitely gets a
Yeah.
bit like tricky,
Then it
right?
can get really complicated. But and so four-way stops get more and more. I would say the bigger the intersection, the more lanes, the more you need to have that battery backup, and you need to be able to handle that extra amount of time, even if it's just being very basic in its function. Goes back to a basic timing approach, or whatever.
So like things go into that flash and they have a battery backup, but then there's also the ability to sort of like bring a truck out there and plug it in and kind of
Oh
power
yeah,
that intersection.
that's right. I forgot about that. You can, if you have an electric pickup, you can just plug it in and power the light.
It
Yeah,
becomes like a power source in a sense, right?
yeah,
But so I mean, I think there's lots of ways they look at it. Thankfully, it's not typically like a huge problem. I mean, I'm sure there's areas where you end up with more power outages. We don't have so many here, for example, so I don't think it's as big a problem for this city. And that's sort of critical infrastructure as well. I'm sure they have a lot of ways to kind of keep that running. I think what's interesting, and maybe this is a good segue into sort of the V2X technology, right, where you're connecting vehicles to infrastructure, to traffic infrastructure, and that word is thrown around quite a bit, but it means different things, right? So V2X is a very broad term. It could even mean vehicles communicating with each other, or to a cloud, but in essence, you can connect these vehicles to the grid. And a couple of advantages for that, right? You can send vehicles warning messages, for example, right? So in the case of, a power outage is one because that creates other complications for the intersection to communicate out. But sometimes the intersection goes into flash, they call it, which basically means something is malfunctioned, and the brain doesn't know what to do, and then the whole thing, like you said, is just flashing red, right?
right.
And that's less to do with power outage as it is with some sort of breakdown in technology or logic or something. But with alert systems, the central control system knows that this intersection is in flash. So theoretically, you could send a message to vehicles in that area because we know based on where the intersection is and the GPS of the vehicle, when all this is sort of hooked up right, that we can send a message to all vehicles heading towards that intersection that this intersection is in flash. So be aware, slow down. You're coming up to a non-normal, type of situation.
Yeah,
But you can also extend that to using sort of AI and prediction algorithms, you can tell a vehicle that it's going to run a red light. So we just talked about red light running. If we know
how about green
you're
light running?
well, that's a whole. You want to have the green lights. Obviously, there's another sort of technology where I can tell your vehicle and it'll come up in your dash and say, well, if you keep a steady 55 kilometers an hour, you're going to hit all the green lights in front of you. And that's understanding the timing of those intersections and where your vehicle is in conjunction to that intersection. In terms of a red light running, it's going to say, well, Patrick, you're in your, car, you're heading towards this intersection, you're doing 85 kilometers an hour.
Warning,
That's way
warning,
too fast, right?
alert,
And it says
alert.
at this trajectory, you're going to hit a red light. And in fact, you can go online and see video of this where you're coming along, the light's green up ahead, but it'll warn you and say it's going to turn red so that if you are going
Right.
too fast, that you can now slow down and ensure that you're not going to hit that. Maybe some people would speed up, I don't know, but the idea is that you're supposed to slow down. It's what they call the dilemma zone. The dilemma zone is
Yeah,
always when you're sort of there, you get an idea, you see countdown, or you see that amber, especially when you visibly see that amber, right? It's always that decision moment of like, do I actually hit the brakes and slow down, or do I speed up a little bit and just like coast through the
yeah,
intersection, right? And
yeah,
that's why they call it the dilemma zone, because as a driver, you're sort of in that dilemma of like,
yeah.
do I have enough time to get through, or should I actually stop? And it actually can be fairly difficult, especially if you are speeding a little bit, right? And it's like your car is going to take longer to slow down, and especially difficult for large trucks. In fact, if you drive on a highway, like a smaller highway that has stoplights, for example, they have those ambers go through much longer because a lot of these highways have larger trucks, so it takes a lot longer for that truck to stop. So if you had a very short amber light, it's not long enough for the truck to stop. When the truck sees that amber, it's already too late because
Yeah,
it's heavy, it's large, it's going at a
it's
certain
going.
speed,
Yeah,
so it's just, there's a lot of sort of science behind those types of things as well
yeah,
around like dilemma zones. But the more vehicles we can connect to the grid and that we can provide that information, to drivers, then we're giving that driver more situational awareness of what's going on at
yeah.
events, warnings. In fact, we can also send them messages that there's an ambulance coming through this intersection, so you should be aware. And if you're someone like me with, Metallica or Black Sabbath cranking inside the car, you don't hear nothing, right? So it's like to get that warning in your dash that an ambulance is coming is probably pretty helpful, not just to
Yeah,
you, but to the ambulance as well,
that's
right?
right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you know what? When we start talking about yellow lights, like I remember one time I was coming up on this yellow light, or it was green, it was getting, and then it turned yellow, So it was one of those later moments where you're almost in the intersection. So I braked a little more aggressively than normal because I was just going to stop, right? Bang, behind me, right? Got rear-ended. So it's the guy behind me. I'm always worried about the guy behind getting rear-ended. So, typically, if it's turning yellow, if I got somebody on my rear end, I'm going through because I don't want to get rear-ended, right?
Well, there's that too. But
Yeah,
you got to
yeah,
make that decision
you
sometimes in a
got to.
relatively
That
short amount of
dilemma
time,
zone
though.
is kind of a tough one.
It's
What
quick.
the law says is very clear. Stop. If you can stop safely, you have to stop. Period.
Yeah.
Right? Um, you're going through it's icy, it's snowy, it's raining, whatever, what have you. Visibility's bad. Um, that's a reason to proceed through cautiously, um, because you can't stop in time,
Well, yeah,
right?
but it's still, I mean, if that guy behind you rear ends, you don't want to get rear ended, but it's his fault because he's following too closely and he's not allowing enough time
Yeah,
for him to
I
brake
rather
either.
not
So,
have the hassle of my
no, we don't want
car.
that for sure, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it's
yeah,
interesting. We just talked about, emergency vehicles. So that's sort of another example of connected vehicles, as it were, right? So,
yeah,
again, back to the company I work for, which is probably why I'm talking so much in this particular podcast this week. But, there's this what they call preemption technology. So, there's an emergency somewhere, right? Whether that's a fire truck or an ambulance trying to get to the scene of an accident or a house fire that, and you oftentimes see this, right? Where it's coming down the road and it's honking and all these cars need to kind of get off the side of the road and what
yeah,
have you, right? If you had advanced warning as a driver, you could do that. But then there's a whole different problem of hitting red lights, and then you see these emergency vehicles coming up and trying to cautiously move through an intersection. They're basically running through a red light, but they have the hope that they don't get T-boned by vehicles coming the other way because they're running against the light. And in a lot of cases, they have to, right? Because seconds count when you're trying to save a house or save a life, more importantly, right? And so this preemption system works sort of in a couple of ways. And a lot of people don't know this technology exists, but in essence, you've got some sort of technology in the vehicle that can be an IR emitter that's sending something directly to the intersection itself. It can be GPS based. It's going through a cloud. There's many different ways we can determine that there's an emergency vehicle that needs to get to an intersection. But sort of back to the Italian job we talked about earlier, this is more of like the up and up version of that, where you can create this green wave of lights for an emergency vehicle on the way to an emergency, where you're saving that vehicle enough seconds that you're literally saving a life. Because if someone's having a heart attack or they've been in an accident, 30 seconds sometimes can mean the difference between life and death. So then we're
yeah,
giving, by connecting vehicles to the grid and being more adaptive and clearing that path, we can do that for those emergency vehicles. Something that's much less of an emergency would be transit. So there's also what they call priority service. And so in a city where you have many buses and many bus routes, you want those buses to be running on time. Because for many people, time is money, or at the very least, like they're trying to, get to their job on time or what have you. But generally speaking, you want these buses to run on time to get people where they're going, because ultimately you want more people taking the buses because that's less congestion on the street. If the
right.
bus schedules are not reliable, then people are more inclined, I don't want to take the bus because it's not reliable. I'm going to go buy a car, and then everybody that buys a car end up with more, right? Whereas every bus on the street has 10, 20, 30, 40 people, whatever it is. You're helping reduce congestion. So it's in the city's best interest to have these buses run on time, that they don't get preemption. Like the lights don't change just because a bus is coming, but what they do is because they know the schedules, they just kind of extend some of those green lights a little bit. So if we know a bus is coming this way, let's just extend that green another 3 seconds. It doesn't really impact the cycles at the
Mm-hmm.
intersection as it does just kind of like just ensures that these buses, because they always run the same route every day, and ensures that they're not getting stopped at every red light, because it also takes them time every time they stop.
Yeah,
It takes time to get moving again. So there's all these different technologies, whether it's across, this pedestrians, vehicles, emergency vehicles, transit, you name it. There's all these different ways to ensure that people are getting where they're going, and it's kind of a giant ecosystem, right? You have many different types of and modes of transportation, and with different purposes and why they're trying to get where they're getting at any given time, and you need this really complex technology, nerve center to help coordinate everything, right? Because even when you're doing preemption or priority, but then you still, once that happens, you still have to ensure that everything kind of settles back into normal so that everything keeps running. You know, an emergency vehicle is going to interrupt that intersection, that intersection needs to get back to normal based on current conditions that may have been a little bit backed up now that everybody's kind of stopped. Like it gets very complex. Everybody thinks that intersections are just, green light, red light, but
Yeah.
there's so, especially in a big city like Toronto or Chicago or what have you, right? It's very complex.
You've seen that behavior, I guess, where it's like the ghost crash. I seen it on the 401. You're driving along, and then all the cars are just grinding down to almost a halt, and everything speeds up again.
Yeah, and you get there, there's nothing there. You're like, why is everybody slowing down, right?
But these what happened was, an hour ago, there was an accident, and people were gawking and carrying on the other lane, and they were all slowing down. So, this behavior, this is all about flow behavior and stuff.
The psychology and everything.
There's still a slowdown point. And you say, well, why does that exist? Yeah, it's really weird, like a ghost event, right?
Or it happens on the other side of the street. You're coming along, what's going on? And actually, it's actually jamming up because everybody's slowing down to see the accident on the other side going the other way. Yeah. Everybody's kind of rubbernecking, right? And you're right in that sense. In fact, one of the things that's always fascinated me is like traffic congestion. You talk about like the ghost accident, but there's also that sort of phenomenon. It's almost like a physics thing where you get so much traffic that it just can't seem to get moving, right? And there's a lot of stopping and going, and everything starts to kind of condense or something, right? Because you've ever gone through an area where it's like everything's really slow and it's stop and go, but there really is no accident, and there never was. It's just that when people don't leave enough space between vehicles is one thing. So then you end up with a lot of people braking because they're riding other people's bumpers, right? Mm-hmm. So then that person brakes and the next person brakes, and everything kind of starts to break down. But then there's also, and I mean, this is the thing that used to drive me crazy. You have these people that are continually changing lanes because they think that, oh, that lane's moving, I should get in that lane. Yeah. But what they don't realize is what happens is that this lane starts moving, which is actually a good thing. Then everybody gets into that lane, and then the congestion happens and it slows that lane. And then the lane that car got out of starts to speed up because you've reduced the cars in that lane. So you end up with this like never ending of people trying to, if everybody would just stay in their friggin' lane, stay in your lane. Eventually, if you all act like normal humans, it will start moving. Stop going lane to lane to lane. It's just, it's not going to work.
That's normal humans going lane to lane.
I mean, don't get me started on people and lane changing, but I get the frustration. I mean, I had a job a number of years ago where I was commuting all the time, like for an hour plus a day, and I was always trying to go, okay, I'll get in that lane and this lane, and what I learned was it didn't matter. It didn't matter how many lanes I changed. It didn't matter what roads I took. It always took me about an hour and 5, an hour and 8 minutes to get to work. It didn't matter what I did or how many lanes I changed. It's just the laws of probability of traffic and lights and stop signs and everything. There really is. I mean, if you work really hard, you might save 3 or 4 minutes. That's about it. Trust me, I tried.
Yeah. Or even on the highway, you clip along 125 or 120 versus 115 or 105, whatever. And so you're trying to get to where you're going, and you realize, at the end of it, you're 3 minutes.
Yeah, do the math. Right? It's not going to mean anything. Even going another 20 kilometers an hour doesn't usually make a huge difference in your arrival time. You can see that now with GPS or Waze or Google Maps, right? Yeah. Your arrival time, like you leave, if I leave to drive to your house right now, it's going to tell me that I'm going to arrive at like 9:22, for example, right? Doesn't matter how fast I drive or whatever. Okay. Doesn't matter, right? Yeah. But ultimately, it doesn't matter what I do. In fact, sometimes it'll say, oh, your arrival time is slightly changed. But I've noticed it doesn't matter how fast I drive, that arrival time never moves by more than a couple of minutes.
Yeah, that's the funny part. And that's all part of flow management too, right? And I think the other thing too, before we get off emergency vehicle preemption, which is the ambulance and the fire truck, we got the old system, right? And the old system is high intensity strobe lights and or infrared strobes, right? And they're actually flashing at the sensor on the intersection. So it's like kind of like a on a sight system.
Well, yeah, and that still exists. So, by the way, you'd be
Right.
surprised at how even with today's, we've got lots of other technologies, but even that technology exists, and for all intents and purposes, it's from what I understand, is still relatively reliable, right? Because you
Yeah.
can look at cloud-based systems and GPS and clouds, but those systems can break down. Whereas, like an IR is like line of sight. I mean, it's gonna, they said that strobe is gonna go from the vehicle to that sensor on the intersection. It's pretty reliable, but on the flip side, you've got to have that line of sight. And so, if you can get those lights to change without line of sight, it means you can actually go faster, and then by the time you get to the light, it's already changed for you. So it's a
Yeah.
little bit of a
Especially
difference
in
in,
complicated,
yeah.
roads and stuff. So, yeah.
Well, that
Yeah.
too, but it's also like a lot of times maybe they'll have both. They may have that more cloud-based system, but they always want, not always, but sometimes they want the fallback to like the more, rudimentary, if you want to call it, reliable type method. So it's, I mean, even some of these really complicated AI-driven systems can sort of malfunction or do the wrong thing sometimes, I suppose, right? They're not,
Yeah.
no system is perfect. So, I mean, the old school we call the dumb signals that are just running on a loop, as it were. Other than they having the odd malfunction, are pretty reliable in that they're going to, things are going to move. They're just not going to be as optimized as they should be, and that's the biggest problem, especially in cities with lots and lots of traffic. It's you reach a saturation point. I mean, I've been sitting in an Uber in Toronto where I'm like, it takes me 15 minutes to get through two traffic lights. I'm like, I should just walk. Like, why
Yeah.
am I in this?
They don't
You're
walk.
just sitting there and the light just changes like 3 times, but like the car doesn't move because there does reach a saturation point on the streets where there's only so much you can do, right?
Yeah.
You can try and
True.
coordinate, but sometimes you just reach that, peak saturation where things just really start grinding, especially in a very, condensed city like Toronto, where in some areas there's only so many ways you can go. You don't have a lot of options. You're kind of at the mercy of the grid, at the mercy of the traffic, and what have you, right?
Yeah. And of course, the chaos factor, right? It's the chaos factor.
Well, yeah.
At work, working against any kind of control system. So no matter how good a control system you have, there's, mother chaos is going to screw that up no matter what. So I think that there's no one perfect system that's going to be able to do everything, regardless of. I don't think people need to really put a lot of faith in a system of saying it's going to be the magical cure for traffic flow. There's just too many things going on, right?
Yeah, well, now you've got like autonomous vehicles and what have you, which is, another case for hooking them up to the grid, because a lot of these autonomous vehicles have cameras and LiDAR and things that are trying to see what's going on, but oftentimes like they're obstructed as well, right? And so like really, I mean, that is, and it is very much a problem. And it's, we're talking about some of the, kind of caveats with technology, but, you know, the technology is there to connect vehicles to grids. The problem is that we don't have critical mass, and there's a lot of different manufacturers and a lot of different technology providers and chip providers, and there's like no single standard for all of that yet. I mean, there are standards in terms of communication standards and so on. I just mean like there's a lot of vehicles on the road that are older that simply don't have the chipsets and the technology to communicate, right?
Right.
They can't even communicate through cellular networks or what have you. And then you've
Yeah.
got a lot of the newer vehicles do, but you still have a mishmash on the road at some point, down the line, because pretty much all new vehicles that are being made have this capability of communicating the chipsets and the connectivity through cellular or what have you, right? Eventually, you're going to reach that critical mass. We're just not quite there yet. And there's sort of two things when it comes to V2X. There's a term called CV2X, and that also brings into play a technology they call PC5. So PC5 is a short range communication. So if you look at, CV2X is both cellular and short range. Well, cellular is obvious. It's communicating up through cellular, through towers, into the cloud, and eventually connecting down through to the intersection through the cloud, whereas PC5 is directly communicating with the intersection. That's sort of the future of, say, emergency vehicle preemption as well, because unlike, IR or what have you, you're actually able, sort of like a cell phone signal, that that vehicle can communicate directly to the box at the intersection. So now you have actually like a direct connection up to like I think 1 kilometer almost, where now you have real-time communication between the traffic lights and the vehicles. So now, in some sort of future where all vehicles are connected, all vehicles will be able to get traffic signal information. They'll know when an emergency vehicle is coming. They'll know when the light's going to flash, and it'll all be instantaneous communication between the intersection and the vehicle. I mean, that is essentially the utopia in a sense, because now you think about it, you've got this ecosystem where the control mechanisms at the intersections are communicating with all the vehicles on the road. And I guess if you wanted to extrapolate this to the far future, which we like to do, if you reach a point where that's completely ubiquitous, now you probably won't even need actual like traffic lights and things, right? Because now all the vehicles will be connected to the grid, and all the vehicles can communicate with each other, and you could just control the flow through some sort of like imaginary grid. You wouldn't need those physical things, but like traffic lights and sensors and everything else, right? But we're a long ways away from that, right?
But you did talk about the fact that we got you can buy third-party V2X devices, like little dash mounts, or one of those ones that actually they replace your rear view mirror, and you have a picture-in-picture camera in there, that kind of thing. So there are technologies that old technology car can utilize, and then you can get the warnings, and it can do the the notifications and stuff out there.
Well, there's even mobile apps on phones,
but you can buy them, and I could see in the future as cities slowly modernize, that it becomes a requirement in order to even run on the road system, that you have to have one of those regardless of the age of the vehicle, right?
This wouldn't be a probability podcast if we didn't talk about some of the the risks and the dangers and things involved around technology, right? Because like any kind of high tech that we talk about, it comes with its fair share of caveats and problems and whatever, however you want to frame that. But when you think about it at a kind of base level, that these systems really have to be secure, right? Because they're they're critical infrastructure to not just keeping people moving, but getting emergency vehicles to places and things that are really important, even like moving goods and keeping the economy moving. I mean, the cost of congestion alone is in the millions, if not billions of dollars at a federal level, and so there's a huge cost there. So there's obviously a security angle of ensuring people can't hack into these systems and either just cause havoc or to bend them for their own needs and so on. But now we're sort of involving AI, right? We're involving these sort of like thinking brains at the intersection, and there's certainly a lot of positive outcomes there. But we all know with AI, there's sort of oddities, there's hallucinations, there's different aspects of just this in this modern era of AI, where now we're sort of unleashing that within our public infrastructure. And for all intents and purposes, it seems to be working out well, but I think it's just something that people need to think about when we're implementing this newer generation of AI technologies and letting them sort of run the grids, and what kind of like risks might crop up there, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a firm believer in introducing controls for all these systems, so they don't or they can't be spoofed by some kind of centralized system outside of itself, right? So if you have another AI system trying to control that system, that needs to be, there needs to be walls up against that, and that way you're not going to have some kind of central AI all of a sudden, taking over a whole city's infrastructure, right? Should never happen if you design, security by design. You implement those barriers within the design itself.
And checks and balances.
Yeah, the checks and balances approach. So to me, I think we are on the cusp of a lot of these systems, but we're also on the fly a lot of these systems. And that,
well, true,
yeah, those those security controls that we talk about are absolutely, very important. We shouldn't allow that spoofing or outside influence. I mean, you could have an actor who could be, have very nefarious plans, not just, catching a green light, right? Um, and with that, end up having to do a lot of damage, right?
No,
So
absolutely. Yeah. I
it's
mean, but
very
that's why
important.
you always need a human in the loop, right? We always
Yeah,
talk about this idea of human in the loop. And I think as systems get more, sophisticated, I think they'll be able to operate a bit more autonomously and so on. But I mean, even right now, to even like change, for example, a timing plan, to make a fundamental change to a timing plan at an intersection, you need to be a certified engineer, and only that person can make that change. And there's sort of, paperwork and audit trails and so on involved with it, right? And so that might seem a little bit odd when we're talking about, adaptive systems and AI. Those are more about sort of like tweaking things, as it were, if you want to look at it that way, or like extending a green light because you see demand. It's not fundamentally changing the timing plan of an intersection, because what you don't want is conflicts, right? So you can literally change the timing plan, in a bad way to where you could create conflict or potential, safety problems at an intersection. And the way you've got, the idea of like, left turn. Sometimes you have what they call like a permissive left, which means that, the light's green. You see that when you come up, and you can make a left, but you have to watch for the cars coming towards you,
yeah,
right? So there's different ways to kind of program the intersection so there's like a safety element there, not just like relieving congestion, but ensure everybody's moving like safely. And so I think for a long time you're going to see this element of human in the loop because of that safety part of it. But as we know, like this AI technology just keeps getting better and better and better all the time, right? And I
yeah,
think it will get to the point, like everything, where maybe it'll seep in more and more. And not saying that you're not going to need traffic engineers, but then maybe those engineers can, kind of look at higher value work or more planning and more generally trying to improve something. And I think there's a lot of use in AI and being more reactive and understanding the health of the network and pinpointing problems really quickly and helping resolve problems quickly, but always allowing that human in the loop, that engineer, to kind of be in charge. I think that's going to be the case for a while. But I think the more tools we can give them, the better. Because I mean, if you spend any time in a big city, I mean, traffic is just, no matter which way you cut it, it's always some sort of nightmare to deal with.
yeah. It's always
And
chaos. Yeah,
there's not much you can do there really, when it reaches a saturation point. But there are a lot of strategies and a lot of engineering that goes behind ensuring things keep running. But I don't know, Patrick, why do they call it rush hour when nothing moves? That's what I want to know.
Thank you for listening to the Probability Podcast. Please join us next time for more